island is where our people have lived for thousands and thousands of years. Our ancestors' bones are buried in the islands. And so they're part of that island, and they're a part of us, like their blood still runs through our veins.
Difficult to tell people how much you love where you're born. You can't express it.
Alaska Native people, were treated as second-class citizens. If you were Alaska Native, they didn't want to talk about that. And they didn't want to hear your language spoken.
And after the purchase of Alaska by the U.S., land claims were repeatedly put on the back burner.
As the state started selecting lands that would be state-owned, so that became a conflict.
And say, here, give these Alaska Natives, see a little handout, they'll be fine. It was much stronger than that. These people demanded, to be a part of change. We're going to have to fight like hell for it.
The story of who owns the Aleutians started long before the passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. For thousands of years, my people have been living in the Aleutians, a 1,000-mile-long chain of more than 200 islands that stretches west from the edge of the Alaska Peninsula.
Describe the Aleutians as the most beautiful place in the summer and the most ugly place you don't want to be ever in the wintertime. It's the worst place I've been and also the best place I've been. I don't think I'd ever seen rain that wasn't sideways until I came to the city.
If you don't respect Mother Nature out here, she'll slap you around there. We get winds in excess of 100 about 5 times a year.
We're known for our wind and our rain and our giant storms that keep our villages shrouded under a blanket of fog. It's the convergence of the Pacific and the Bering Sea. And my people have been thriving here, living off the sea, hunting, fishing, dancing, expanding over the Aleutian Islands for thousands of years. But the islands weren't always the Aleutians, and my people weren't always called Aleut.
So in 1741, Europeans arrived here in this region. First 2 ships, one captained by Vitus Bering, Captain Commander Vitus Bering from Horsens, Denmark. Shortly after 1741, other Europeans arrived, Russians arrived in the region in search of sea otters, and they gave the name to the people in this region, Aleut.
When I was growing up, the word I knew was Aleut. I didn't even hear the word Unangach until I was in middle school, I think. And it was a big, it was pretty confusing at the time. I was like, what's going on? Who are we?
Unangan is the word of our language as we identify ourselves. Unangan. Some people could be, easily hurt by asking them, "Are you Aleut?" They would probably go on to define this. "Oh, I'm in Unangan."
The language of identity isn't always black and white, and even amongst our people, there are many shades of gray.
I am a proponent of the use of Unangach and not Aleut or Aleut.
I know a lot of people, I have relatives that say Unangan, but we're Aleut.
It's Unangan, not Aleut. We are Unangan people.
Most of the time I just say I'm an Aleut because I have parts of Russian in me and Norwegian from my father's side too.
When you say, when you ask me, "Are you Aleut or are you Unangan?" it's like you're saying, "Are you a Caucasian or are you a white person?"
They're both the same.
I didn't know what Unangan was for a long time.
In our own language, Unangam Chinu, our word for ourselves is Unangach. How each individual chooses to identify is clearly a personal choice. What we can all agree on is from who the word Aleut came from and what they were doing here.
the Russians came and, used our people for the fur trade and, decimated populations. Our region is a region rich in resources, and that attracted a lot of moments in history that weren't really great moments for our people.
The first people that arrived in 1741, that was more of a scientific expedition. But after that, in 1745, the people that followed the Bering expedition were not kind people. And that continued and intensified through the 1760s. They were very brutal to them. They systematically exterminated the Unanga people. The population dropped from very high to very low. What it was very high, we don't know exactly. Some sources say 12,000, some say 25,000. Some say higher numbers than that. But when the official population was taken here in Alaska, it was less than 2,000 for the entire region. So massive slump of the population.
Being the closest region to Russia, Unanga people bore the brunt of Russia's early brutality. The Aleutians became a jumping-off point for expansion around the Gulf of Alaska, with the Russians setting up outposts around the state. But they were spread thin. Under mounting pressure from other colonial forces, Russia decided to sell Alaska, despite the fact they hadn't stepped foot into most of the state.
Yeah, well, the Russians came over and, conquered our lands and enslaved us and everything, but they sold their rights, but not our rights.
There's arguments today, rule of discovery. Did Alaska, was it ever really owned by Russia? Alaska Native land claims were constantly put on the back burner, including in 1867.
In the official transfer of land between Russia and the United States, they referred to Alaska Natives as the uncivilized tribes and conferred no citizenship or rights. For our ancestors, the situation had become arguably even worse.
Alaska was run by basically the United States military, and those continued to be harsh times for the Unanga people, particularly the Pribilof Unanga people, where they were enslaved to hunt fur seal.
The United States basically purchases, what was the Russian American company owned, right? Some trade posts, and they knew that fur seal harvest was highly lucrative.
They immediately farmed out Alaska to private industry, to monopolies in San Francisco and Seattle to handle the fur seal trade, which was, back then, that was the gold back then. Even salmon wasn't on the radar then. It was the seals and the sea otters.
The U.S. government quickly gave out an exclusive 20-year lease to the California-based Alaska Commercial Company, who grossed around $28 million off the project. But after decades of overhunting, when the otter and seal populations had plummeted, an international treaty was signed by the US, Britain, Japan, and Russia that outlawed open water fur seal hunting. In turn, the United States government took complete control of the administration of the fur seal harvest on the lands of the Pribilofs, including governing the lives of the Pribilof Unanga people, even after Alaska Natives were given citizenship in 1924.
I think it's a dark spot for the United States to recognize that when the Russians then left, the United States continued that practice.
Other events much further south in the Pacific would change the world forever.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards.
A few months later, on June 3rd and 4th, 1942, the Japanese Imperial Navy bombed on Alaska. About 43 Americans died during that attack. That had a big impact on the Unanga people, to literally have bombs falling out of the sky.
I wasn't around, but remember hearing stories from my grandmother about, painting their windows black so the planes flying over wouldn't see light.
I was scared. I was afraid we were going to die, actually. You didn't know. And then there was no protection, basically, on the front beach. Even though they dug little holes, there were no protection.
More than dropping bombs, Japanese forces invaded the islands of Aleut and Kiska in the far western part of the Aleutian chain.
Eventually, they took 42 Unangan people from Aleut prisoner of war to Japan. At the same time, the United States military forcibly relocated 881 Unangan people from the Pribilof Islands, the Aleutian Islands, forced them to move over to southeast Alaska.
They were trying to protect the people, I think, from getting killed. The conditions in southeastern Alaska where they were put was pretty darn drastic from what I gather.
It was their decision to move us.
Yeah, was it everybody living here or just...
No, just the natives. The white people got to stay.
So if you're less than 1/8 Aleut or if you're white, you could stay. So, clearly that was not a military necessity. The United States military wanted the people out of the houses so that they could move military people into the houses.
It was a burned out cannery, basically. So we had to rebuild everything. But it was also exciting for kids. If you can imagine, first time on a ship, first time we saw trees or frogs. But it must have been hard on the older people.
No, they were not provided the things that they needed to survive. They were given like an hour, pack your bags, only bring one small suitcase with you. No, they were just dumped in these abandoned canneries. The conditions there were horrible. A lot of people died unnecessarily over there.
Over 3 years, 10% of the people who had been evacuated died while they were kept in southeast Alaska. Sometime after the war came to an end in 1945, the military brought the remaining Unangan people back to the Aleutians, but the conflict had made Alaska's importance to the country clearer than ever. Within 15 years, Alaska was admitted as a state, which granted it certain rights, among the most consequential, land ownership.
This was becoming a very tumultuous situation because after the Statehood Act in 1959, the state of Alaska moved and acted swiftly to start making their land selections.
Native people weren't consulted, and so literally land was being selected from underneath their feet.
The state started selecting lands that would be state-owned, and these are lands that we had lived on and occupied and flourished and took care of for millennia.
The state's desire to acquire land was directly in conflict with what different indigenous leaders from around the state knew. We had a valid legal claim to our land.
By 1950, when they came back from the war, after the internment, they immediately filed the land claims for all of the Aleutians and the Pribilofs. And they were like the fourth ones to file. Obviously, Southeast Alaska Tribe was first, and then Arctic Slope came along, and 2 other ones. So it was a long process, 20 years before it was actually taken seriously by Congress.
By the time the Statehood Act arrived in Alaska in 1959, Alaska Native land claims had been put on the back burner repeatedly, and Alaska Natives took a stand.
I oftentimes refer to it as the Native Solidarity Movement, and they begin to realize, wow, they want to dam up the Yukon River, they want to go to nuclear testing, they're arresting duck hunters, so they begin this amazing effort of really banding together and supporting one another.
The different regions found they had more in common than they once thought, a shared aggressor. For the first time, Alaska Natives had a way to communicate their struggles across the large state through a newly formed paper, the Tundra Times.
The Tundra Times played a pivotal role in connecting Alaska Native peoples. This was the first time that they were able to communicate across the state, because until then we only had radios, CB radio at the most.
It was a political newspaper covering all of the different issues that different Alaska Native people were dealing with. It was vital because it was the only vehicle that other Alaska Native people had to learn about what was happening in other regions.
One of the more impactful and carefully written about stories belonged to our region, the government control of the Pribilofs.
There were a number of different articles in the Tundra Times in which they began covering this. I want to say exposing what was happening there. So it was shocking.
Fish and Wildlife Service issued food and provided services back in those days, and in lieu of wages, every Saturday you would go down to the government store, and all the bags are on the floor for each family. And so you got your bag of groceries, and that's supposed to last you a week. Well, it almost never lasted a week.
But the U.S. government had made millions over the years since they took over the administration of the commercial harvest of the seals. And after statehood, the state of Alaska started receiving 70% of the profits. In 1960 alone, that amounted to a significant portion of their budget.
These are not parts of our country's history that we look back and feel good about the role of the United States when it came to how our Native people were treated.
You know, I have conversations with individuals from the lower 48, and, they think slavery ended in the, 1860s. Well, slavery was a continued practice all the way up until 1980.
We were actually slaves to the government for the first seal harvest, and the monies they paid weren't much, nothing.
While the United States government didn't call it slavery in name, there were countless overlaps in practice.
By the early 1900s, our people became wards, the slaves of the trade. They didn't think of themselves as slaves. They didn't think of themselves as wards. But the United States owned every nut, bolt, everything on this island, and on Anarachjalo, St. George Island as well.
They weren't able to leave the island. They can't control whatever government agent is going to come in and dictate to them what they should or shouldn't be doing. And it was kept hidden. It was hush-hush. It was a secret. It's maybe a step above slavery, but not much of a distinction.
Thanks to the Tundra Times, the conditions on the Pribilofs had been brought into the light. And while it took a few more decades until it was settled, at the time, it was another issue that helped to galvanize Alaska Natives around the state.
The Tundra Times was a way to proliferate information about what everyone was doing and get everyone connected on the same page and really riled up for our land claims and our Alaska Native rights.
This was also the time of the Civil Rights Movement. There was a very large young demographic. So we had a lot of young leaders that were very willing to lead the charge, very willing to demand rights, also demand to be heard and organize.
And it was like everybody was thinking about the same thing everywhere you went. There was Native leadership from Point Barrow to Sandpoint, Alaska, to, Juneau, Alaska.
You have to remember what the 1960s looked like in rural Alaska. These people were coming together in a way that it shouldn't have worked, but they made it work. I mean, we had villages sending advocates by raising money through bingo and bake sales.
In 1966, our people created an organization called the Aleut League to represent us in the fight for land claims.
So in 1966, A. Malnati wrote a number of these different Native associations, I think 17. He wanted them to come to Anchorage to meet in an effort to form an umbrella organization, and they call it the Alaska Federation of Natives.
This was unprecedented in Alaska and around the U.S., but this once-in-a-generation effort was only possible because of another conflict.
What was driving it was the discovery of oil in Prudhoe Bay.
The National Petroleum Reserve, an area larger than the state of Maine, has long been known to be a probable source of oil.
And probably the real reason it turned out the way it did
is because the oil industry needed a route to get to Valdez.
They just wanted to ram the pipeline down the center of Alaska without recognizing our rights. And that's kind of when AFN got organized, all the tribes got together and said, we need to act as one.
The pipeline, our Alaska pipeline, is just one of the projects we very desperately need. Court decisions that go back way into the last century give validity to native land claims. In fact, the natives of Alaska now claim over 90%, almost all of Alaska.
The young state had a serious problem. They had no way to build a pipeline and get it to market because Alaska natives were also claiming land. In response to this dispute between who owns the land, Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall enacted the land freeze.
The land rights of the Alaska Natives have never been defined. This has always been put off. And they're going to get the shaft, they said, because the state now wants to pick some of the land that they've been living on and so on, and you've got to stop it. And I said, well, how can I stop it? And they said, you can write a piece of paper that says Alaska can't select any more land until the Indian land rights are decided.
That land freeze prevented the state of Alaska from selecting any more land until the issue of land claims was resolved for Alaska's first people.
The land freeze accomplished something remarkable and at the time unheard of. It aligned the interests of oil and gas companies with the indigenous people of that land.
You know, the industry got together and they said, well, you know, the best way to shut somebody up is give them a piece of the action. Let's silence the ones that make the loudest noise, and the other ones will follow. And that's basically what happened.
Alaska Native people became strange bedfellows with the oil companies. This resolution had to come, and it had to come quick.
The pressure was on, and Alaska Native leaders from around the state were pushing to get as much of our land back as possible, now with the help from oil and gas lobbyists. From our region, one of the most involved leaders was Flory Lukianoff from St. George.
He was influential and very involved in ANCSA in the early days and in the passage of ANCSA. In fact, he would travel to Washington, D.C. and advocate for ANCSA.
He was pretty outspoken, very knowledgeable. He probably had more of an idea of where this thing should go than most of us that were actual board members at the time.
Because of our early exposure to Russia, Flory was laser focused on a single provision.
So he created what is affectionately referred to today as the Aleut provision. Alaska Native people were allowed to be considered Alaska Native if their village said, that person's Alaska Native. Had that not happened, we would have many Aleut shareholders who could not have provided or met the BIA's blood quantum requirement.
Ideas were flooding in from around the state, and different bills were advancing in D.C.
I mean, you hear a lot of people talk about, well, we knew we were going to do this and we were going to get control of all this stuff. I'm not really sure anybody actually knew how it was going to turn out.
There were early pieces of legislation that said Alaska Natives get $10 million and, a small amount of land and we'll call it good. And it wasn't good.
The shape of this would be wholly different than anything else the U.S. had done.
But if we look at the United States at that time, 1971, Nixon was president. There was this big anti-communist war going on. They were, the start of the Cold War and everything. And they didn't, Native people, they're like, oh my gosh, they're communists. Like, let's make them capitalists through this corporate system, which was an experiment.
Treaties and reservations, like they have in the rest of the U.S., weren't much of a consideration in Congress. This new system called for the creation of corporations, and the Alaska Natives in those areas were to become shareholders in those companies.
Everything was in flux, Then they started dividing up the country, Alaska, into 12 regions. And then they divided into 212 villages on top of all that. Then they split the surface from the subsurface and made everything so complicated.
This piece of legislation passed very, very quickly. And essentially what it did was it restored 44 million acres of land to Alaska Native people. That's 12% of the state. It also provided $962.5 million.
They came out with Angska, and I think that was better than anything else that was on the market at that time. Were there pieces left out? Were some areas got a little bit less than others? Yes.
You know, like southeast, they got timber. Up in the Arctic region, they got oil. And, interior, they got minerals, and we ended up with rocks.
Some regions were blessed with the resources that were in their backyard. And in Aleut's case, it wasn't the land that had the resources. It was the water that sustained us. It was the fish and the seals. That was our resources. And the land claims did not address our access to the water and the fish and the seals. And so, in a sense, we got cheated in the Aleut region of any resource that truly belonged to us.
We'd be a different corporation today. I believe the Aleut would be a different corporation. They'd be part owners in the major canneries, major boats.
You know, our people are ocean-based people, sea-based people. We need to have a water settlement, not just land settlement.
When you hear the story of Angsa from those who are actually there pushing and advocating for this piece of legislation, it is remarkable to hear stories of how close this fight was. Alaska Natives very well could have gotten nothing.
This wasn't perfect, but the hope was that it would be more perfect than anything that came before it. And on December 18th, 1971, AFN held a meeting at the Alaska Methodist University, and over the speakers played a recording sent in from DC.
I want you to be among the first to know that I have just signed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. This is a milestone in Alaska's history and in the way our government deals with Native and Indian peoples. It shows that institutions of government are responsive. Best wishes in your convention.
I was involved in a teleconference with President Nixon at Alaska Pacific University. Oh, everybody was pretty happy.
I can only imagine the excitement and how proud everybody must have felt for fighting in a world in Washington, D.C. that they might not have understood, but fighting for their people and their right and their land.
That feeling didn't last long, because now, and quite suddenly, in order to form the Aleut Corporation, our people had to set up boards to govern the company.
One of the major problems was that there was so much politics involved in it that the business part of it kind of got left out.
No one in 1971 had a degree in business or business management for that.
If there was 500 people, I bet you there were 50 that knew. Hell, we had to have Ford Foundation and Boeing came up here and explained to us what we were doing. Seriously, we didn't know how to put a corporation together.
You know, and we were scattered in all our communities. It was hard to get people who could be interested. So what they did is most of the folks that first got involved with the Aleut Corporation happened to be the ones that were in Anchorage.
Peggy came home one day and said, well, they're going to start putting together regional corporations and they need board members. So they had Lily McGarvey, Mike Swetzoff, Iludor Filimonov, Charlie Huff. Lily wanted to know if you would sit on the board. And I'm like, yeah, I guess.
The first job of the early board, they had 2 years to get their shareholders enrolled.
After 71, there was a big push to get enrolled. They came down to the high schools. Representative came down and said, land claims has passed. There's going to be 12 regions. You get to register in one of those regions.
I don't think we really know about it until Mike Swetsoff, Carl Moses came here with Orange Heber on his widget. Said we're going to have a meeting here about changing us to become landowners.
Even with early leaders like Mike Swetsoff and Carl Moses going around to help with enrollment, it was confusing for people who'd never even heard about land claims. And the initial question on people's minds wasn't board structure or what the company would do.
The initial question is always, when do I get my money?
I don't know if every corporation got the same amount or how it was figured out, how much you got on the first check, but if I remember right, we got a check for $500,000. But all of a sudden it was like ka-ching, the bell went off, right? There's money. Everybody wanted to be board members.
Back then we had a board that consisted of the 13 villages plus either one or two at large. So it was a real big, wieldy board. It was difficult to get anything done.
A lot of Native corporations went into what they knew. And our region, we went into fishing.
Our first two investments were 120-foot king crab vessels. Both of the boats ran about $1 million. I did the accounting for both vessels, and I think we did about $280,000 net income. It's not bad, but we couldn't sustain it because of the decline of the king crab.
It was just timing. His timing with getting nothing involved with fishing probably hurt the corporation a little bit.
And I told him, I said, well, with the current makeup of the board and who's running the board, you people have no fishing experience whatsoever, even though you live on an island. It didn't work because they jumped into something they didn't understand.
Early mistakes compounded, not just in our region, but around the state.
It's difficult. I always use the phrase to spin straw to gold. That is, take a stack of money and invest it. It's a difficult concept. It's very hard to do.
During the 1980s, Alaska Native corporations were in crisis. The 1980s were difficult years for every Native corporation. I mean, we were not doing well, and that includes the Aleut Corporation.
Many regions' poor performance was even more notable when compared to the success of others. But there was a provision in ANCSA that had been written to address that resource disparity between the regions.
They tried to make up for that with 7I, 7J. We get a share of that income.
So 7I is the revenue sharing agreement, that was agreed upon, following ANCSA and leading up to the present day.
Southeast Alaska, with its timber sales, for example, became one of the biggest cash distributors of 7I revenue with all the timber they were harvesting. And of course, Nana, with its mine that they opened up, Red Dog Mine, it's probably bigger, if not the same as Arctic Slopes oil production in terms of revenue sharing.
What came out of Red Dog for the Aleut Corporation probably saved their ass a couple times.
Some of our initial missteps were helped in a big way by the resource sharing provisions. Some years, it was just enough to help us stay afloat.
We expended a lot of money into ventures such as shipping, fishing. A lot of times those ventures didn't work out well, and we lost money.
We've gone through rebirths, but I think the 80s were by far the most difficult years for our Alaska Native corporations, and we have the numbers to show it.
But eventually, we turned a corner and started to get the hang of it.
Native people are resilient, and we've made it work.
They were able to manage these corporations, to learn the structures, and to really make it their own unique thing.
The Aleut Corporation's ability to weather the storm allowed the company to start looking ahead, starting with the distribution of the first dividend.
When I got a check, I really understood that. I think we all did, it was maybe $50 or whatever, but we were happy with it. It was money to us, it was growing, and investing, takes time for all that kind of stuff to be done.
We declared our first dividend ever. Every year had been a losing year, a $1 a share. Whether it was a penny a share or $1 a share, we were over that hump. And so it's kind of like a psychological hump.
These cash payments are distributed to all of the shareholders of the Aleut Corporation every year. But that's not all the corporation does to help the region.
That Alaska Native corporations, our mission is our people. So we work hard to develop programs that benefit our people in a variety of ways. That could be education, burial assistance, dividends.
Of course, then the Aleut Foundation came along when we got scholarships, which we never had before. That was good. That helped me a lot out.
Because I think most of us received our college money and went to college because of Aleut Foundation, which our early board members established.
While good work started to increase and positively impact our region, many shareholders still think we could be doing better.
I think if they incorporate more like mentorship and engagement opportunities, when I always bring up these things, I'm like always saying, you need to make opportunities at the higher management levels for us so that we can be running our corporation.
It is incumbent on you to move forward and learn how to read a financial statement, question your leaders and boards of directors, and ask them how and what they're going to do to make things better and turn things around.
Despite our stumbles and setbacks, it's important to reflect that it's only been 50 years since the creation of the Aleut Corporation. The Unangach people have been around for time immemorial, and this isn't the end. Just another chapter in our long history.
As we look to the future, we just always need to be ready and to take on these challenges and continue to evolve and change as the world around us changes. The one thing that underlying is our tie to our people and our culture, and that value will always remain.
This is only the start. 50 years is a small drop in the bucket. You know, we're 10,000 years in the making, and there's still a lot of uncompleted needs and asks and purposes of the future of the land claims and the regions and tribes.
Despite some of the three of the most powerful governments in the world, that being the Russian government, the Japanese military, and the United States government trying to erase us from the face of the earth, we're still here, and we're going to continue to be here for another 10,000 years plus.